In the early 1940s, Negro League baseball was thriving. The industry of the Negro Leagues was booming and making a living for different types of people, such as the players, teams, owners, and coaches. When looking at such a successful program, the question often arises, why did the Negro Leagues begin to dissipate? And with that, what were the effects? At the time, America was still a very much segregated country, and the major leagues were strictly open to the white players. It was not until 1947 when the Negro Leagues began to fall. At this time, the infamous Jackie Robinson played his first game with a Major League Baseball team. This was a turning point for baseball and for America as a whole. Many doors that were previously sealed shut were opened to these African American baseball players. The positive effects of this transition largely outweighed the negative ones, as this was a huge social advancement for the country. There were, however, some negative effects that often go unnoticed. It is crucial to look at these effects because they provide insight to a part of the country's history that often is forgotten. When the Negro Leagues began to disappear, many people lost their jobs and livelihoods, and many African American players lost their chance to play for a professional team. Since the desegregation of Major League Baseball led to the end of the Negro Leagues, this could have led to even more racism in society. It could have caused resentment towards the white race by the African American players who were negatively affected. The Negro League began to dissipate because many of the Negro players began to sign with major leagues, which in turn led to the loss of interest in the Negro Leagues as well as the major decline of income for players, coaches, and team owners.
The history of the Negro Leagues began due to the issue of segregation. African Americans were not given the same opportunities as the white race. An example of this is in the game of baseball. An agreement called the Gentlemen's Agreement was passed where they agreed to not give any contracts to African American players. The establishment of this agreement ended African American players playing in organized white baseball. When African American players were no longer allowed to play with white baseball players, Rube Foster decided to put together the Negro League in 1919 to allow African American players a chance to play baseball. After the establishment of this league, Negro baseball grew for 23 years before its eventual fall. Rube Foster, the man pictured in the center of the team in the first image and in the second image, had previously played on this Negro League baseball team. He later managed and owned this team from 1911 to 1926. The baseball team was known as the Chicago American Giants. The American Giants were seen as one of the strongest Negro League teams. In the first decade that the team was together, they never lost a championship. The team won the Negro World Series in 1927. These images were chosen because Rube Foster is the man who is responsible for creating the Negro League. He made a large impact for African American baseball players during the time of segregation. After the Gentlemen's Agreement was passed, African American players no longer had an option to play professional baseball. Rube Foster created a league to allow these players to have opportunities that white baseball players were receiving. Rube Foster was seen as a hero to the African American race. After the Negro Leagues ended, he still is remembered as someone who made a great change during the times of segregation.
After the Civil War, baseball became a very popular sport in America. With the start of this sport, people could already tell that it was headed towards segregation. The people that were in charge of the National Association Amateur Baseball League had all signed an agreement stating that African American players would not be able to take part in their league. But in 1920, Rube Foster created the Negro League. Eventually, the Negro League dissipated with the death of a man called Kennesaw Mountain Landis. He was a segregationist and baseball commissioner. With his passing, Major League coaches began to show their interest in the African American players. After African American players signed with the Major Leagues, they would still be hazed by their teammates, opponents, and even some coaches. The Negro League vanished because too many of their players had signed with the Major League teams. Unfortunately, because of what had been happening in the past with the Negro players versus the white players, several people were upset about some of the Negro players joining the league. Negro coaches and players that did not continue on to the Major League were very upset and thought that it was unfair that some of the African Americans could now play on the same field as some of the white players. Some white players lost their contracts with their teams due to African Americans coming over and joining their league. As expected, these players were very upset about losing their spot in the Major League and tried to fight the fact that African Americans were now a part of their league. Kennesaw Mountain Landis was the first ever baseball commissioner. There was a big scandal in 1920 with the American League and the National League team owners. Huge gamblers apparently had been paying players on the White Sox to purposefully lose games. After this scandal, Landis was given the full power to make changes to the game of baseball if they were in the sport's best interest. With this power, he made contracts stating that African Americans were not allowed to take part in any league with the white players. Landis was a huge lover of the game of baseball, but was very against African Americans and whites being equal. Landis relates to the fall of the Negro League greatly. Landis not only was a baseball commissioner, but he also was appointed to be judged by the president, so he had a bunch of power in the law system. People knew that if they crossed him, it would get them nowhere but in trouble. So after his death, coaches in the Major League came forward and said that they had been scouting players in the Negro League, but were scared to come forward about it. Eventually, the contract that Landis had drawn up was agreed upon to be ended. 3 short years after Landis' death, the first ever contract with an African American in the Major League.
When examining the end of the Negro Leagues, there are several different viewpoints that one can observe. For example, one of the Negro League teams. The Cleveland Buckeyes won the Negro League World Series in 1945. This win was such an accomplishment for the team, as they were not a team that was consistent at winning large titles such as this one, and because of that, they were not expected to win. This feat should have made the city of Cleveland incredibly proud, but the win seemed to be overlooked. At this time, the eyes of the baseball world were turned to Jackie Robinson as the major leagues began to integrate. This meant that for teams like the Buckeyes, their feats would not be seen in the same light as they had been previously. The only thing the city did for the boys on the team was have a banquet when such an honor deserved much more, such as a parade and a meal with the mayor at the least. This viewpoint is useful when studying the decline of the Negro Leagues because it is more specific than looking at the history in general. This is important when looking at the effects of the end of the Negro Leagues because it helps to humanize the players more instead of just looking back at them as names that can be read about in a book. One is able to put themselves in the players' shoes and sympathize with their situation. They are able to see the effects of the desegregation on the individuals of the team, not just the league in general. This student interview goes to show that although most people in our generation have some prior knowledge about segregation as a whole, they are unaware of the specific events. In this interview, the student had absolutely no previous knowledge of the Negro baseball leagues, let alone the effects of their demise. Can you tell me any prior knowledge you have about segregation in America as a whole?
I know our country has a history of racism that stems from slavery. I know that there were a lot of laws that were supposed to keep things separate but equal, but clearly that things weren't equal.
Do you have any prior knowledge about the Negro baseball leagues?
No.
Okay. How do you think integration affected the major leagues?
I'm sure that it caused a lot of tension among the players, and I bet a lot of people had a problem.
What is your opinion on how the integration of the major leagues affected the rest of America as a whole?
I think it probably helped the country become less segregated.
This was an interview with a student athlete here at the University of Kentucky. She has a lot of knowledge about the sport of baseball in the Major League, but did not have very much prior knowledge on the Negro League. This interview shows that young people know about segregation, but do not know a lot of little facts behind it that had an impact on people.
What is your prior knowledge towards the integration of Major League Baseball?
Black and whites couldn't play baseball together in the past, but then Jackie Robinson came along and now they could play together.
What is your prior knowledge towards the Negro League?
The Negro League was formed because blacks couldn't play with the whites in the major leagues.
What present-day effects, if any, do we see because of this integration?
Blacks and whites are friends now, and they can play the same sport together, and there's a lot more diversity in sports because of it. Yeah. Thank you.
The fall of the Negro Leagues was a slow and painstaking process. The men in this picture stand on top of the rumble. They work to speed up the process of tearing down the structure. Much like construction, it can take a long period of time. Many events and circumstances led to the destruction of this stadium. The stadiums that these Negro teams played at served as gathering places and focal points to communities. With the destruction of the majority of these stadiums, they fight to be remembered, much like how the Negro League fights to be memorialized. It is hard to infer from this picture why this stadium was torn down. That is why it is important to remember our past. The history and effects of the Negro Leagues are often forgotten amongst our society. We highlight the integration of Major League Baseball and the fall of the Negro Leagues. During a time of immense hatred and bigotry in our society, these Negro Leagues thrived. The Negro Leagues created a sustainable lifestyle for many. It brought happiness and inclusiveness for players, coaches, families, and communities throughout our country. Although it is easy to point out the negatives of the Negro Leagues coming to an end, we must continue to point out the numerous positive effects that come with the desegregation. The integration of baseball in America's pastime was vital to the growth of our country. This was during a time when baseball was the sport of America. Citizens endured the integration of this popular aspect of American culture. This influenced how other aspects of life were perceived. It opened many alleys for integration in other areas of life. The fall of the Negro Leagues can be correlated strongly with the integration of the Major League. In the grand scheme of things, the fall of the Negro League goes untold, although it created countless opportunities for our nation.